Good morning, everyone. This is Mike Bryan, Youth Engagement Manager for CyberUp. Today, I'm joined by Bob Hernandez, the Chief Engineer and Solutions Architect at SAIC, to talk about Linux and its importance and usage in cybersecurity. If you have any questions, then you can throw them in the chat box, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, or Bob might answer them during the presentation. And otherwise, take it away, Bob.
All right, so what we wanted to talk a little about today is this little thing called Linux. And in the cybersecurity realm, Linux is kind of like the cybersecurity samurai sword, right? You know, I like to kind of think of it that way because it's definitely a tool of the trade when it comes to cybersecurity. So it's something you want to, think that way. Definitely don't think of Linux as just something you think you might want to know. It's definitely something that you need to know. So a samurai wouldn't go anywhere without their sword. A cybersecurity professional wouldn't want to go anywhere without Linux. So definitely something you want on your tool belt and as a major part of what you do on a daily basis when you're out there in the cybersecurity realm. So usually I talk about a few things up front. We'll probably have some late joining participants, so I won't go into this in too much detail. If you're watching this as a recording and you have a number of questions, if you reach out through Mike, I'm sure we can get some of those answered. And love to answer questions. I love to get emails, so if you want to reach out and ask those questions, I'm happy to answer any questions that might come up. So we also had a Mentimeter question that was going to come up, just trying to see what the pulse is on folks and what kind of experience that they have in Linux. Although again, we'll probably have some late joiners, so we'll skip over that today. A little bit about myself, all right? Well, who are you? Well, I'll let you know when I find my profile on the dark web, because that's what everybody else will know me as well. So, but it's keep calm and do stuff and things, right? So we all do a lot of different things in our professions, and in the cybersecurity realm, you're going to learn a whole lot of things. So the important thing is just hold on for the ride and learn as much as you can and keep moving forward. So and that's kind of what I've done throughout my career, but I'll give you a little bit of a background. So Chief Engineer on Programs, work for the Department of Defense with SAIC, Solutions Architecting, Software Engineering, Cybersecurity Engineering, and really just about anything that comes across the board that's technical in nature, right? So what is a Solutions Architect is usually one of the questions that I get on the regular, and it's ultimately just a problem solver, right? So when you look at whether it's a software engineering problem, electrical engineering problem, cybersecurity engineering problem, solutions architects tend to go after those problems and find the solution to those that meet the needs of what we're trying to solve. Served 3 military commands within the DoD: United States Transportation Command, Air Mobility Command, and the Surface Deployment and Distribution Command. Those all actually reside on Scott Air Force Base in Shiloh or O'Fallon, Illinois, depending on how you want to look at it. And so we support those commands there and do a lot of things for them. Primarily what those commands' responsibilities are to move the people, beans, and bullets across the country and across the world. And so we work through a lot of software and processes and everything else that goes along with that. And then data analysis and cybersecurity. So I primarily work out of Scott Air Force Base, but even as I'm doing this recording, I'm actually at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So all over the place is kind of where I like to say that I'm at, but if you kind of try to narrow it down, it's just a couple of these that I work through mainly. Also work, sometimes across the globe, and if what you get connected to, well, it's everywhere, right? Even in space. So even here at Kirtland, I'm working on some the new space area of the government, right? So the Air Force, you have the Marines, you have everything, and now we have our space division of our military. We're doing some work here, so fun. So what we wanted to do is just answer a couple of basic questions around Linux, because if I were to tell you everything about Linux, well, I'd need at least 50 minutes and pretty much 8 hours a day for 5 days a week to really teach you everything that there is to know about Linux. But just a few questions that we just kind of wanted to run over. One is, what is Linux? Is Linux for just IT pros, or can really anybody use it? What websites will help me learn more about Linux? Good advice for the Linux noobs? And how can I gain some serious Linux skill? So we're going to answer those today. And of course, if come into any other questions that come up after this recording, we'll see if we can get some of those answered too for you. So here comes the history lesson, right? So what is Linux, right? Well, there's a couple of things to really think about when you think of Linux. Is where did Linux come from? So before there was Unix, and when you're early on or you're just finding out about Linux, and then you hear this word called Unix, you go, "Is that the same?" And the answer to that is yes and no, because they're very foundationally they're very similar, but they are in fact very different, and they have different purposes. So Unix was developed back in the 1960s, and it was primarily used for mainframes and servers, instant out there for internet connections, etc. And it had a good purpose for those. There was lots of variants of Unix operating systems, much like you see on the Linux platform, but there was one particular one that was called Minix. And then there's this guy, and his name was Linus, and he decided that I liked Minix, but I feel like I'm a super smart guy, and I'd like to make something of my own that has a little bit more efficiency or done just a little bit differently, so I can really grab onto the power of an operating system and do what I want to do. So when Linus Torvalds entered the scene, he wanted to make a better Minix. So he wanted it to be like Minix but better, right? And so that is the creator of Linux. His name is Linus Torvalds. So if you start taking all these star Nixes, right? You have a Unix, you have a Minix, and then you have a Linux. And if you're wondering how they came up with the L, well, look at his first name, right? And that's where you come through for Linux. Now, what's important to know is that what Linus was really working towards was the operating system's kernel. Right? So what he put together was a new kernel, and that was in the early 90s that he started to put those together. But there was also another entity that was involved in creating the Linux that we all know and love, and that was with the Free Software Foundation. They were on their own mission, and when they were out to create something, they created something called GNU, right? And so GNU, what that was really the utilities. They did not focus on the kernel that Linus was working towards, but they actually worked towards all the utilities that you see that are part of the operating system today. Put those two people together, or that entity and person together, and get the Linux that you use today, right? And so you're getting all of the utilities that are underneath the covers, and you're getting the kernel itself, and that is what creates. So a new OS was born at that point in time, and so that gives you a little bit of that history. Now, one thing to notice is that, well, you say Linux, but if I'm browsing the web, there's always the next question: which distribution are you going to work with, right? So just like Linus wanted his own version that gave him the power that he needed to be able to do the jobs that he was looking to do and solving the engineering problems that he was looking to do with the operating system, everybody else wants that kind of customization as well. And so that's where those, what is called distributions, come into play. Right? And most of the distributions that are out there today are some variant of some of the popular ones that you see on the screen, right? So even one of the most popular ones onto is really Debian based, right? And it's just got some more utility put onto it, and it has a number of flavors that make it a little bit more user friendly. Some of the big differences between Linux and Windows is that Linux users typically are wanting something a little bit lighter weight. They want it to be fast, they want it to move quickly, to be able to do their job right away. When you come to Windows and even all the versions of Windows that are out there, you'll notice that if you hit the on button, it's going to take a while before you can actually start it. Right? It's gonna load a number of things in its kernel, and it's gonna load a number of other utilities and drivers and everything else that some of it you won't need. And so that's where the customization in Linux really started to shine. You have some very, very light versions of Linux, that'll just boot in seconds and you're ready to go, right? But they also don't have any of the other things that you might need. So your needs are really going to determine which Linux you want to use. And so customization is really the key when it comes to the Linux operating system. All right, I don't see anybody online at the moment, so I don't think we'll have any questions about the histories of Linux. So we'll go ahead and move on. All right, so is Linux just for pros, right? Normally you see out there that if you hear of Linux, it's always somebody that's working with it, right? Whether they're in a data center and they're working the servers, or they're security professionals using it. You think of that all the time. Is Linux just for pros? Well, some of the big time pros that are using Linux are Google, NASA, U.S. Department of Defense, and CERN, that's Responsible Collider, that's out in Europe, right? So those are all using Linux as their main desktop operating system, right? So you may be watching this webinar on a Windows machine. If anybody from Google or the U.S. Department of Defense or CERN was watching it, they would be watching it through their Linux desktop. And so, yes, some of the big time pros are using Linux, but that is not all who it is for, right? So the rest of us, what can we think about when we think of Linux? Well, there are a number of educational distros that are out there. So if you're a Linux newbie and you're wanting to learn more about Linux and you want to use a distro that is conducive for educational tasks, they have Linux versions that are targeted even at 4 and 5 years old. They have some learning distros that are out there that are designed to get people familiar with using computers and kind of getting that introduced. So you see a lot of young students that are out there and they're working with a lot of tablets and laptops and Chromebooks and all things. Well, Linux is out there for that as well. Of course, there's security distros, which is what we're all focused on, right? So there's a number of them that are out there that are very popular. One of the most popular being Linux, that is for folks that are getting into cybersecurity, folks who are looking to be penetration testers, right? And so it doesn't mean you have to be a pro to be able to use that. You can download it. It's very easy. Get it set up on your machine and get it right away. So basically, there's a Linux distro for everyone. That's kind of what I like to think about it. Right? Whether you're 5 years old and you want to play games or learn some basic concepts, whether you're just getting started in computers and you want to know more about how to use operating systems, there's distros for that. Whether you are an avid Windows user and you find it hard to get away from Windows, there's distros that even allow that to be a little bit less painful, right? So there really are distros for everybody, not just the pros. And if you find Linus Torvalds online and he's trying to beat Saber, give him some help. I don't know. All right, so when it comes to meat and potatoes, everybody says, Bob, enough talking. Give me the websites. Where can I go do my own research? All right, where can I go find all the things that I want to do or learn about? Well, and this is probably just scratching the surface of the number of websites that are out there, but I find these ones extraordinarily useful when you're trying to learn more about it. One of the first one and the last one are some of my favorite items that are out there to really just kind of start getting familiar with things and learning things. Right? So distro.net, if you haven't been out there, go to that website, right? Check it out, because just about every distro that you can think of can be tout on that website. So they have the ability to virtualize that Linux distro. in your web browser so that you can make a connection to it. They spin it up, you get out there, you can start with it, you can see what the desktop looks like, you can see what all the utilities are, you can see what the built-in software is into those distros. If you are not sure you want to dedicate a machine or a virtual machine or anything like that to the Kali Linux distro, you can go try it on distro test.net. Right? You can get out there and see what it looks like. And it's not just the most recent version of those distros. Sometimes they even have a number of older versions of those distros. So if you are a little bit more experienced in Linux and you go, hey, this older version, had a tool set that I really like to use that they got rid of in a later tool set. It's like, was that the one that had it? And you can go find that out, right? So you can do a little bit of history or forensic analysis going back on those distros. If you're looking for straight out, tutorials and things to teach you step by step, there is a Linux Fundamentals course on linuxacademy.com that you can get to, and it's very, very, very helpful. Now, one of the reasons why I like Nixcraft is because it has a host of how-to articles in Linux. We're going to go through a list here just a little bit of some of the key skills you want to gain and learn through the Linux operating system, and many operating systems for that matter. But Nixcraft has tutorials and how-tos on almost all of them, right? So if you don't want to go through a regimented class and you just kind of look up, hey, I'm trying to do this task, Nixcraft is going to help you with that, right? There's a lot of resources over there, step-by-steps, that can kind of help you get familiar with how to do the tasks you're looking to go for. All right, so that's the website's candy, right? So feel free to take a look at those. Hopefully those are up long enough on the screen that you can get to those and go and type in through to get to all the sites that you want. Now, what I want to focus on next is really for Linux newbies or skill master seekers, either way, right? These are some of the foundation things that you might think you're pretty darn good at Linux, but if you don't have all of them mastered in the next items that I'm going through, you're going to want to get to it, right? Because the more that you can master these skills within Linux, the better off you're going to be. You will be able to do a lot more. You'll be able to perform a lot more security tasks. You'll be able to perform a lot more tasks in general just by knowing some of the concepts that we're going to talk about here. So the first one being Linux system and network administration. Sounds like it's a whole big field of its own, and it is, right? So there's really a lot to it, but whether you want to do penetration testing, analysis, or some other sort of security monitoring, whether you're going to do that on a Linux server, a network device, or any other appliance, you really want to know how to do the key system and network administration functions in Linux, right? Doing this is really foundational to knowing the operating system itself. All right, some of the things that are in here that you just want to make sure that you have a pretty good level on for Linux administration and network is one, knowing how to view all this information, right? Figuring out what the architecture is, what the kernel version is, file system layout, user information, groups, a number of other items for that system information. Not only is just useful to help you troubleshoot or find other problems, but it also is going to help in any reconnaissance activities that you're doing. Right, so when we're playing and working to capture the flag items that I know that are scheduled coming up in the future here, knowing find the system information in any system that you're on is super important, and knowing how to get to that and practice getting to that is going to be integral to making sure that you're successful on that. Next things are really viewing and modifying the network configuration. If you are a Windows person or a Mac person, a lot of that stuff comes pretty easily, and even Linux distros make that very simple to get connected to a network. But knowing how it works underneath the covers from a system administration standpoint is really going to up the ante, right? Knowing where your IP configurations are, how the ports are there, any installed services and the like are really going to make your knowledge much more useful when it comes to performing activities in Linux. You also are going to want to know how the Linux system starts services, right? There's a couple of variants of there. Most of the time, if you're seeing things online or tutorials and or video on YouTube, you're going to hear mostly about system D, right? But that's one of the methods that Linux uses and the kernel uses to be able to start services. So getting to about how that works, what it is, researching those, right, is really going to help you out a lot. Knowing how to modify key system and service configuration files. This is going to be a key item for your capture the flag events, right? So when you can go in through and perform some of these activities, know what each of those configuration files are, what's contained in those configuration files, and what they affect. Because when you're working with Linux, it's the most simple thing to think of, that everything in Linux is a file, right? And everything runs off of a file, right? All the services run off of a file. Everything runs off a file in general. So all of those files can be modified in one way, shape, or form if you know how, right? But just like, getting yourself into trouble in other operating systems, you can do the same thing in Linux, right? So have to know what those are and what they do and how they are configured. Tricky thing inside Linux is that depending on how it is all set up, you may think you're in the right spot to make a modification, and you'll find that it's actually overridden by something else, right? So understanding the ins and outs of that are going to be important. Next, you want to know how events get logged, right? There's a couple of popular and key items out there for Linux, rsyslogd or journald, right? So when you are in and you're performing either penetration or reconnaissance or other things, all the activity that you're doing inside a Linux operating system is logged, right? So if you're looking to how to cover up your tracks, which I know is a skill, and I'm not sure if everybody has learned that yet through the CyberUp program, but you're going to want to know where those things are logged. So you need to cover up your tracks while you're doing an exercise. You know where to do so. Next thing is going to be installing software on a Linux distro, right? And there's a number of ways to do that depending on which distro you're using. You can see a couple of them listed there. And yum, sounds like you're going to go out to lunch, but it's not that. It's really a method to install packages on a Linux operating system. And so you want to learn how to do that. A lot of the things that you are going to, if you're planning or trying to use the Linux distro as your desktop system, you got to know how to install your software, right? Because without your software, your operating system, will look nice and still log everything, but it doesn't become very useful until you start using the software to perform the tasks that you're looking to do. Right. Next thing you want to do is focus on physical and logical file systems. And especially when you used to do analysis or any type of forensics, you'll want to know more about imaging data on that system. Right? And then in cybersecurity, analyzing the content of key or suspicious files will be critical. Right? So if a hacker is inside your system and they have dropped a payload in there that will be used for malicious activity, you're going to know how to identify those files and how it got there, using the logs that we talked about earlier to figure out what got there, when, and how, right? But then also analyzing what's in them, right? Because they're very often going to contain scripts or references to other scripts that will be used by other programs, and so you want to know those are. Right, and then the last item here from the system administration perspective is connecting to remote systems. Some of the most common methods today are using SSH. And previously, Telnet was actually really popular. So understanding how you connect to some of those systems, because many of those are going to be through a command line interface, you're going to want to know how to do that pretty well. All right, so it looks like we had somebody join. Edward, do you have any questions about what you're seeing up here so far? I'll take that as a no and just keep plugging forward. Thanks for joining us, Edward. Stop us anytime if you have any specific questions. Since you are the only student at the moment, the floor shall be yours. Okay, so next thing is really thinking about, we talk system administration and network administration. Regular expressions, if you don't know what they are you want to know how to do regular expression very well. It is not an easy thing to learn. It is definitely, I'll equate it to doing trigonometry, where you have to memorize what sines and cosines of 45-degree angles are, right? You know, it's like, how to calculate that? Well, calculating it's not easy. You end up basically memorizing it. So what regular expression is going to use, it's going to use a lot of things that you're going to want to memorize, right? But it's very, very powerful tool to help you search through things, right? So if everything's a file, how many files in the Linux operating system? Wow, it's more than I can count, right? And so when you're looking to do forensic analysis, or you're looking to do any type of reconnaissance, you know, using regular expressions and being able to search through those things is going to be a critical skill that you're going to want to know, right? And you want to practice it as much as you can, because if you don't use it for a while, you'll forget it. Just like I couldn't tell you what the value of sine 45-degree angle is. It's been too many years. But regular expressions is something, the more you use it, the more comfortable you'll get with it, and the better you will get at it. And it is definitely a skill that you want to get really good. There's a number of websites that are out there. If you do a Google search, and I didn't put them in this presentation, but I should have, that will help get you good at regular expressions. There's some games and things out there that kind of help you get good at knowing, you know, what thing put into a command line regular expression search that will help you get good at that. Okay, next thing is going to be SELinux and AppArmor. So those items out there, and they're really focused on the security of Linux. Like, those two capabilities in a Linux operating system are basically your wall of defense, right? So knowing how those work, knowing how permissions work with SELinux and AppArmor, and how they allow permissions, knowing how they allow applications to do certain activities on a Linux operating system, are all going to be very important. So studying how those items work and knowing how they are configured, knowing how to reconfigure them, knowing how to make adjustments to them will help support you in learning and understanding the security aspects of Linux. All right, so we had some website candy, right? And we talked about Linux quite a bit. But the meat and potatoes of how you make Linux useful is really in the tools, right? And so from a cybersecurity expert or professional's perspective, there are so many tools that are out there to do different functions. If you had to shell out cash for every single of those tools or apps that are out there, you'd be spending $1 million, right? Fortunately, the cybersecurity community and then Linux experts are out there, are very giving, community sharing people, right? And we create a lot of open source tools to help us do the jobs that we have to do. And there are a ton of them. All right, so open source, I put the link down there at the bottom. It's a nice little reference from CompTIA that kind of shows you a number of the tools that are out there. But, you know, coming through here, one of my favorites, and there are some people like a couple of other distros that are out there, but one of my favorites is SELinux. Not just because it has a really cool dragon in front of it, right, but because it's already packaged up, ready to go, and has most of the tools going to need. You know, so rather than going through and saying, hey, what tool should I install on my Linux distro that will help me with cybersecurity, you can download the distro that basically has most of the ones you're going to use right off the bat. And you can see some ones that I have bolded here in this text are included with Kali Linux, right? One of the things that there's a tool there that has a pretty decent curve to get used to, but is foundational for reconnaissance work that you're doing in cybersecurity, is Nmap, right? There's a lot of sheets and guides that are out there that help you use Nmap, but it's an extraordinarily useful tool that lets you know more about the systems that are on a network, right? So you can use that. You can actually use that on Windows as well. They have a version there, but Nmap is definitely a key tool that will help you in reconnaissance work and footprinting, right? And there's also some vulnerability analysis tools, traffic analysis tools, penetration testing tools, all included in there. And then the last thing that you're going to want to really familiar with is a security information and event management tool. Right, there's a couple of them that are out there, so if you can get familiar with those, it really helps you because most folks are using those to aggregate all of the information for security and events. Understanding those tools and working with those tools are going to be a huge plus. All right, any question on open source security tools? All right, Edward's still quiet. We're going to keep moving. So next thing that you're going to want to do is get pretty familiar with bash scripting, right? So being able to run shell scripts, write shell scripts, parse shell scripts, understand shell scripts are a key skill to learn and to know and when you're using Linux. Windows now has an ability to be able to pull up a scripting prompt for bash, the latest version of Windows. I can't remember which build number that is, but it does have capability. So even Microsoft recognizes knowing how to use bash is an important thing, right? So definitely if you aren't familiar with that already, you want to get out there and learn how to use bash. Okay, so following on stuff you need to know. How do I get good at Linux? I have a few recommendations for you. Because if you kind of do it maybe at night every now and again or on the weekend and you take a course, maybe you'll eventually learn things. But it'll be at a pretty slow pace. If you want to be a cybersecurity professional ninja and want to get really good at Linux, there's a couple of things you might want to do. First thing is replace your desktop. Right? They tell you that if you really want to learn a new language, if you want to learn Spanish or if you want to learn French, right? Some of the best ways to make yourself fluent in those languages is to engulf yourself either in that country that's the primary language or in a culture or an area where that is all you speak. Right? So the first tip here is replace your desktop, because if you do replace your desktop with the Linux operating system, you'll have no choice but to figure out how just about everything, right? And you can do so pretty safely, because hey, if you got homework to do and you have to do that in Microsoft Word, can you do that on Linux? Yeah. Is it harder? Yes, right? So you can also do some things to help shore up your risk on that, right? You can create and get a distro that has or down VM VirtualBox. Right, and that will help you actually run Windows from your Linux box. Right, so fear, right? So if you're not sure if you want to pull that trigger, you can do so with very little risk. Right, so replacing your desktop is really get you entrenched into using Linux, and highly recommended if you're serious about it, do it, because you will learn everything that you know in Linux just by doing that and having to perform all your regular tasks and normal activities. Next thing is we talked bash just a little while ago. Run everything you can from the command line. Right? Start to move away from using desktop icons, open applications, and using things like Windows Explorer to find files and those types of things. Right? Run everything from the command line. If you can learn to navigate through your operating system from the command line, you're going to become expert level and most of the tasks that you're going to need to do as a cybersecurity professional as well. Of course, do training, right? I talked a little bit earlier about a finalist course that's available on linuxacademy.com. It gives you an overview. It doesn't take too long to complete that course, but it gives you a lot of knowledge. Next thing I like to say is quit using your mouse. And that sounds like a weird one, right? But if you get really, really good and you say, you know what, I'm just going to take this mouse, I'm going to put it in the drawer. Guess what? You will be forced to do a lot of things from the command line, right? And you will learn how to open that command line with text only. You'll learn how to navigate everything in that command line, be able to access everything on your computer all without using a mouse. Right, you'll learn every keyboard shortcuts that is out there and available, and become second nature, just like if you went to another country and you had Spanish classes that you took and you went there to learn the language. You're going to do so by replacing your desktop, using the command line, quit using your mouse. Right? And then, there's a couple of other things that you just want to get really familiar with, because a lot of the times we don't deal with the permissions on files and a number of other things very often, but in Linux you do. It's foundational for what you're able to do with an operating system, and that's very, very important to security. So practice changing files, permission owners, and groups. Do those things on the regular. Once you've done that, then you're going to feel like you're good enough to go through that file system quite comfortably. You're going to do some more things, right? It's really about practice. If you're not practicing on the regular and you're not forcing yourself to practice by changing of your behaviors that you're used to, like using your mouse or using a new desktop, you won't get entrenched and learn it fast. If it's your job already, you may do it as a part job, and that will help you get familiar with it. But when it's not your job and you really want to learn and get entrenched, you definitely want to practice. So I've put some things in here that you're going to want to get used to. You definitely also want to learn how to program things in Linux, right? Learn how to use the compilers that are available. Learn how to use the editors. All of those things you might be really comfortable with Microsoft Word and writings in Microsoft Word, but using an editor inside the command is going to be a whole different world for you. All right, so learning how to do that will definitely help you get entrenched and become very good at doing basic tasks that will support any cybersecurity career. So with that, I will close out with a little phrase or a little saying that I like to give. It says, Linux is like Wi-Fi. If you don't know what it's like to have it, you won't miss it. But if you do, it's hard to live without it, right? So if you've been on 56K dial-up modem for the last 15 years, you don't know any better. You don't know how good and how fast the internet can move. But if you've got Google Fiber or you've got something else, and you download full movies in 3 seconds, and you can, to anything you want, lightning fast, then you're like, how could I ever live without this? And for me, that's kind of how I like to equate learning Linux, right? You will never know how, and I'll probably sound a little ornery for this, but you'll know how bad Windows is until you use Linux. So with that, I've wrapped up. So Mike, I don't know if we'll have any questions with Edward, and it looks like Margaret was on for a bit. She disappeared.
Yeah, she disappeared.
Questions?
Edward, do you have any questions for Mr. Hernandez? I guess that's a no.
I'm guessing that's a no.
Oh, he said he put it in the chat.
Yep.
No, sir. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, Bob, for that extremely interesting and in-depth informational presentation about Linux. I feel like I learned stuff today, so that was awesome. I also want to plug our Power Up Cyber Games. So for anybody that's interested in a youth monthly cybersecurity competition series, please reach out to me at powerup@wecyberup.org. Then next week, we have one more webinar in our series that's going to be cryptography. I will be joined by another gentleman next week, not Bob again. And then you can always find us on our social media. We are CyberUp on LinkedIn and Facebook, and at WeCyberUp on Instagram and Twitter. So follow our pages and comment on our posts, please. Anyway, thank you again, Bob. That was excellent. Appreciate your time today, and thank you for being able to make it work even though you were at another location. That is, I'm very appreciative of your time. So thank you, sir.
All right. Have a good one, everyone.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.